Hey everyone, welcome to Strange Stories, where we explore near-death experiences and supernatural stories from people who've had a glimpse of the other side. If you enjoy our content, please consider liking the video and subscribing to our channel. Without further ado, let's get to the story of the day. I had a near-death experience, or NDE, around the age of 30. On August 17th, 2010, I turned 71 years old. I was a full-time journalist photographer living in Melbourne, Australia at the time of the incident. I was raised and educated in a fairly strict Roman Catholic household, but at the time of my NDE, I was an outspoken atheist with no religious affiliations. I am of Celtic descent with Irish and Scottish ancestors. Prior to the actual NDE, I had been suffering from an excruciatingly painful appendix which was recurring on a regular basis and gradually becoming more painful with each episode. For a day or two, I was doubled over in pain, but the condition vanished. I avoided doctors on purpose because I distrusted the medical profession and hoped that the illness would go away on its own. When I noticed the symptoms recurring on this particular occasion, I hurried to a cousin's house because I was alone. There was no one home. I collapsed outside the house's back door, doubled over in agony and moaning. It felt as if something inside my guts was attempting to rip its way out with a blunt knife, and I could distinctly feel that the internal terror was not going away, but rather intensifying. I felt something exploding within me, and gratefully lapsed into unconsciousness. When I awoke from my coma, I was astounded to see myself looking down on my crumpled and immobile body on the floor. It was not a nightmare. My conscious state was matched by the clarity of my vision and awareness. I was fully awake and aware of my surroundings. I'm confident that if a third person had been present, I could have heard any sound or speech coming from below. I began to feel uneasy and perplexed. I couldn't figure out why I felt disconnected from my physical body and couldn't feel it as part of me as it had always been. Then I felt a force, an energy, or an influence overtake me and begin to draw me away from the dead thing on the floor. It felt like I was in a tunnel and my conscious self was being rushed somewhere to an unknown destination. The speed terrified me. I believe I closed my eyes and waited for whatever came next. After a few seconds, I felt the rush slow down. Surprisingly, I opened my eyes. The dead person who had once been me had vanished. I could see a powerful light somewhere in the void above me. It wasn't simply a light. It radiated a powerful love that seemed to encompass my entire being. The sensation of traveling slowed, and I found myself in some sort of vacuum or hollow space, a featureless landscape with a brilliant loving light over it that somehow eased my fears and made me feel at ease with my unfamiliar surroundings. I was then vaguely aware that I was surrounded by spiritual presences. In a physical sense, I couldn't see anything. It was simply an acute awareness that had been instilled in me. I had the distinct impression that the presences were of people I'd known in the physical world. There was, without a doubt, my grandmother and father, while the others were ambiguous but oddly familiar. While we were connected, they exuded a deep love and concern. I heard a voice, not out loud but inside my head, as if it were being communicated spiritually. It was stated, "You haven't completed everything. You must return." I began to protest, but without a response. I found myself back in that tunnel, speeding crazily down the tube, all the while acutely aware of what was going on. To be honest, I was convinced by this point that I was insane. There was no other explanation. I awoke in my physical body, fully aware of what had happened to me, and I simply lay on the floor, perplexed by my brain's strange imaginings. My cousin quickly returned, found me, and summoned a doctor. The doctor quickly examined me and announced that he would call an ambulance and have me taken to a hospital for surgery right away. I caught myself saying, "Don't be concerned. I've been cured. I'm fine now." He became enraged and exclaimed, "Don't be a moron. I believe your appendix is ruptured. That has the potential to kill you. I will not be responsible for you if you do not follow my advice." I managed to reassure the poor man that I was fine, and he left looking troubled and uncertain. I had no further episodes of appendicitis after that. I quietly left my journalistic endeavors and began traveling almost instinctively. I traveled to Australia's far north, to the wild country of Arnhem Land and the Northern Territory, and accepted an invitation from the tribal Aboriginal people of the Rope River area to help the elders document their sacred ceremonial matters, mythology, and so on. I lived in a tent on the banks of the crocodile-infested river, and at night, with a torch clenched between my teeth, I used my portable typewriter to document their ancient beliefs for the first time. I ate sparingly and lived their way, which meant a lump of damper or crude bush bread smeared with golden syrup every couple of days. Naturally, I wondered why I was there and what, if anything, I was supposed to do with the experience. I simply felt it was meant for me to do this chore, whatever the outcome. My primary goal was particularly hazy at the start. Over time, I noticed that the old Aboriginal men and women retained their traditional art and craft skills. They lacked marketing channels, however. Furthermore, I began to envision how the elders could establish training programs for the youth. I applied to the Aboriginal Arts Board in Canberra, explaining how, with the necessary funding pulled from various government departments, art craft training centers could be established in even the most remote Aboriginal communities across the country, and the products marketed nationally and internationally. Finally, my idea was accepted and generously funded. I assisted in the establishment of training programs in remote bush camps and on cattle properties where Aborigines lived, teaching not only traditional activities, but also ceramics, leather craft, fabric design, wood carving, and so on. Later, the Aboriginal Arts Board relocated me to Perth, Western Australia, to help establish a leather craft industry among alcoholics and criminals. Following that, I was transferred to remote rural towns with sizable Aboriginal populations to launch similar projects. It was clear from the start that I knew very little about art and craft work. I began to read training manuals. However, one night, I remember going to bed worried about how I was going to begin teaching the fundamentals of leathercraft. The next morning, I awoke with the thought indelible in my mind: just pick up the tools. When I did this, I discovered that I could understand how the various tools were used almost intuitively. I even invented a tool by fitting a metal bolt into an embossing tool, as well as a new style of leather carving that was distinct and ideal for executing Aboriginal motifs as a form of decorative adornment. After several years of hard work, I was able to look back and see a string of successful Aboriginal art and craft projects scattered across Australia, some of which eventually blossomed into lucrative international enterprises and continue to be so to this day. I was able to write a full account of this strange adventure from the journal I kept on that first camp on the riverbank in Arnhem Land, a book called Journey into Dream Time, which I'm currently preparing for publication. I didn't tell a living soul about my NDE for years. I assumed it was due to a temporary bout of insanity brought on by my agony, some anonymous calamity brought on by a vivid imagination and a desire to escape the reality of my suffering. Much later in life, I came across a book titled Life After Death, and it was then that I began to relate my experience to people I thought would not mock me. As we paced the corridors of the Royal Perth Hospital in West Australia, where my wife was dying in the intensive care ward, I finally mustered the courage to confess to my mother. Mom came to a halt and looked at me incredulously before saying, "That was all in your head, son. It wasn't true." I've been aware of a self-healing capacity since my NDE all those years ago. Some friends claim I can heal others from afar, but I'm not sure if this is true. If I cut myself while working with machinery, say doing woodwork, I simply place my hand over the wound and the blood stops flowing. By the end of the day, the cut should be completely healed. I believe I can perform similar healings on animals like dogs and horses.